Leonard Kane was a billionaire who had everything: power, wealth, and fear at his command, but he also carried a secret obsession that would one day bring him to his knees. To the world, he was untouchable, a living legend who conquered industries and silenced enemies, but behind closed doors, he was a man consumed by paranoia. He faked his own death in a private jet crash, a decision that would change everything. Why would a billionaire pretend to be dead? How far would he go to test loyalty? And what shocking move would his wife make that no one saw coming? The news broke like a thunderclap. Private jet crash claims life of billionaire Leonard Kane. Reporters swarmed Kane Manor, stock prices tumbled, and television anchors wore black as though royalty had fallen. To the world, this was the end of an era. Kane wasn't just another tycoon, he was the steel-eyed empire builder who once told a rival, "If you want loyalty, buy a dog. If you want power, buy people." But those closest to him were less certain. Leonard Kane was too careful, too calculating, too controlling to vanish so suddenly. He didn't believe in fate, and he certainly didn't believe in accidents. For decades, he had built his $300 billion empire on fear and ruthlessness, crushing unions, bankrupting competitors, bribing politicians, and burying secrets that could have brought governments to their knees. He was a man who planned everything, even his legacy. Could such a man truly burn out in a crash? Inside Kane Manor, silence reigned. Isabella Kane, his widow, appeared before cameras dressed in black. Her face was unreadable, grief without tears, poise without collapse. The press expected her to be fragile, to fade into the background as vultures circled the empire. But Isabella's calm presence planted a seed of doubt. Was she broken, or was she about to break the mold? Meanwhile, 5,000 miles away in a hidden estate outside Zurich, Leonard Kane leaned back in a leather chair, watching 5 giant screens replay the chaos. His lips curled into a thin smile. The markets were in free fall. Politicians were scrambling. His boardroom was in disarray. And most of all, his wife, Isabella, was at the center of the storm. "Perfect," he whispered to himself. "Let's see who mourns, who schemes, and who dares to move against me." This wasn't tragedy, it was theater. Leonard had staged his death not to escape but to test loyalty. He wanted to know who would betray him, who would rise without him, and who would crumble. In his mind, it was the ultimate show of strength. He expected chaos. He expected his empire to falter. He expected his wife to remain silent and obedient, just as she had for years. But Leonard Kane's obsession with control blinded him to the one truth he never saw coming. The moment he disappeared, he unleashed a storm he could never contain. And the first strike of that storm would come not from his enemies, but from Isabella herself. Isabella Kane was known as the billionaire's wife, a woman wrapped in diamonds and silence, but behind her still eyes burned a brilliance the world had forgotten. She was expected to weep, retreat, and play the grieving widow, but instead she stepped forward into a spotlight she had once been forced to abandon. Why would a woman silenced for years suddenly rise? How could she challenge the shadow of a man who had controlled her every move? And what would happen when the world discovered she was far more dangerous than they thought? The cameras loved Isabella that week, but not in the way anyone expected. At Leonard's funeral, reporters whispered about her composure. While others sobbed and clutched tissues, Isabella stood tall in a black silk dress, her chin lifted like a queen surveying her court. Her voice, calm and measured, carried across the hall. Leonard Kane was a man of vision, but no empire should ever rest on the shoulders of one man alone. Those words made board members shift uncomfortably. Investors froze. The widow wasn't mourning, she was maneuvering. Isabella's past had been erased from public memory, but now it returned like a buried weapon. She had once been a Harvard law prodigy, hailed as the next great reformer. Professors said she would change the face of American justice. But Leonard had changed her path. He convinced her that marriage to him would mean power, partnership, influence. Instead, she became ornamental, a wife displayed at galas, silenced in boardrooms, and constantly reminded of her father's disgrace. Her father, Miguel Alvarez, was an immigrant who worked 20 years in a steel plant before Leonard Kane's corporate takeover bankrupted it. Families starved, pensions evaporated, and Miguel died of a stroke shortly after. Leonard used that story as a weapon against Isabella, reminding her, "Without me, you'd be nothing but the daughter of a failure." For years, Isabella played the role Leonard demanded, swallowing her brilliance, hiding her fire. But now, with Leonard gone, she tasted freedom for the first time. And she wasn't going to waste it. Her first move was bold. Instead of letting Kane Industries drift into panic, she called a press conference. Standing before microphones, she announced, "The empire will not be run in fear." From today forward, Kane Industries will rebuild trust with its workers, communities, and partners. The world gasped. Leonard's iron grip had left scars across industries, destroying unions and silencing whistleblowers. Isabella's promise of reform wasn't just business, it was rebellion against his ghost. But rebellion carried risk. Investors accused her of betrayal. Politicians whispered that she was exposing too much. Even members of her own household staff wondered if she had lost her mind. Yet Isabella remained unshaken. She had been underestimated her entire life, but now she intended to use every ounce of the intelligence Leonard once tried to bury. Still, one question haunted the air, unspoken yet inescapable. Was Isabella Kane rising to free herself from her husband's shadow, or was she building something darker, a legacy of her own that would eclipse even his? Daniel Reed was Leonard Kane's only brother, a man erased from the Kane legacy years ago, but his sudden reappearance at the funeral turned whispers into thunder. He had been branded a thief, an outcast who betrayed family trust, but now he walked back into the spotlight with a calm smile and eyes full of secrets. Why had he returned now? How much did he know about Leonard's empire, or his supposed death? And what would his presence mean for Isabella's fragile rise to power? The murmurs began the moment Daniel Reed stepped into the cathedral. Tall, weathered, and dressed in a modest suit, he looked nothing like the glittering mourners draped in black designer fabrics. His eyes scanned the crowd with a sharpness that unsettled those who remembered him. Some gasped, others muttered, and a few cameras quickly shifted toward him. Daniel had once been Leonard's closest ally. Together they had started Kane Steel in their 20s, working 12-hour days in sweat-soaked warehouses. But somewhere along the way, Leonard surged ahead while Daniel vanished. The official story was scandal. Leonard accused him of embezzling millions from the company. Daniel denied it, but Leonard's word was law and Daniel was cast out. Since then he had lived in obscurity, surfacing only in rumors. But here he was at the billionaire's funeral, walking directly toward Isabella. The widow's eyes locked on him, unflinching. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice steady though her pulse quickened. "Isabella?" he replied with a faint smile. "You wear power well." Their exchange was brief, but it sent ripples through the room. Board members whispered furiously. What was Daniel doing here? Was he after reconciliation, or revenge? After the funeral, Daniel's presence became impossible to ignore. He gave cryptic statements to reporters. "Leonard wasn't the man you thought he was. None of you knew the whole story." Those words stoked fires Isabella hadn't started, fueling speculation that Leonard's empire was built on betrayal deeper than anyone imagined. Privately, Isabella met with him in the manor's library. Daniel leaned back in a leather chair, his hands folded. "Your husband stole from me, Isabella," he said, his tone calm but laced with bitterness. "He built his empire on my back, then erased me. I don't believe he's dead. And if he is, then you and I both know the truth about what he left behind." Isabella studied him, her expression unreadable. She didn't confirm, didn't deny. Instead she asked, "And what truth is that?" Daniel's smile was sharp. "That Leonard was never the genius the world thought he was. He was a parasite. And now perhaps you and I have unfinished business." The tension between them was palpable. Was Daniel an ally who could help Isabella seize control, or a rival waiting to exploit her? The lines blurred as his cryptic words lingered. For the first time since Leonard's death, Isabella felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Daniel Reed had returned not just to mourn, but to stir a storm that could either destroy her or make her unstoppable. But one question gnawed at her mind, a question she dared not voice. Did Daniel know the truth, that Leonard wasn't dead at all? Charlotte Gray was a journalist who built her career on exposing powerful men, but her name became forever tied to Leonard Kane when whispers of an affair spread through society. To some, she was just another scandalous distraction, but to others she was the only person who ever got close enough to glimpse the truth behind the billionaire's mask. Why would she choose now to speak? How much did she really know? And what secrets would her memoir unleash on Isabella's fragile empire? The book hit shelves like a thunderclap. Its title was simple but deadly, The Man Behind the Iron Throne. Written by Charlotte Gray, it promised to reveal the untold truths of Leonard Kane. Within hours of its release, it became a bestseller, plastered across news feeds, talk shows, and late-night monologues. Charlotte was no stranger to controversy. She had been a rising star in investigative journalism, fearless in exposing corruption. But her career stalled when rumors swirled that she was romantically involved with Leonard Kane. He denied it. She never confirmed it. The ambiguity became her curse. Half the world called her a liar, the other half called her a temptress. Now in her memoir, Charlotte wrote with a mix of admiration and venom. She described Leonard as brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. She painted a picture of a man who thrived on manipulation, who treated loyalty as a currency and betrayal as a sport. But the book did more than attack Leonard, it cast shadows over Isabella too. Isabella Kane, Charlotte wrote, was not the silenced trophy wife people assumed. She was intelligent, calculating, and always watching. The question isn't whether she knew what Leonard was doing, it's whether she was quietly preparing for the day he would fall. Those lines ignited a media firestorm. Was Charlotte hinting at collusion? Was Isabella part of Leonard's darkest secrets, or the quiet architect of his undoing? The memoir raised more questions than it answered, and Isabella suddenly found herself under scrutiny. In public, Isabella dismissed Charlotte's claims. "The words of a woman chasing relevance in the shadow of a dead man," she said in a televised interview, her voice steady but her eyes burning. In private, however, the memoir rattled her. Charlotte knew too much. Some of the details, about Leonard's offshore accounts, about his secret meetings with politicians, about his paranoia, were things only someone very close could have known. And then came the most dangerous revelation. Charlotte hinted that Leonard had spoken often of staging his own death. She didn't outright say he had done it, but the suggestion was there, hidden between the lines like a whisper. Leonard, watching from Zurich, laughed bitterly as he flipped through the book. "Clever girl," he muttered. "She wants to play." But Isabella didn't laugh. Because Charlotte Gray wasn't just stirring the past, she was threatening to expose a truth Isabella couldn't afford to surface. The world was beginning to suspect Leonard's death wasn't what it seemed. And now Isabella faced a terrifying question. Was Charlotte Gray simply chasing fame, or was she deliberately planting the seeds of something far more dangerous? Evelyn Kane was Leonard's only daughter from his first marriage, a name long buried under scandal and silence, but her sudden appearance after his death reignited old wounds. She had once despised Isabella, calling her a gold digger and a fraud, but now she stood shockingly by her stepmother's side. Why would a daughter betrayed by her father return? How could she shift allegiances so quickly? And what dark truths about Leonard would she reveal that even Isabella didn't expect? The tabloids had a field day the moment Evelyn arrived at Kane Manor. With fiery red hair and a gaze as sharp as broken glass, she carried herself like someone who had survived wars the public never knew about. For years she had lived abroad, severed from her father's empire. Leonard rarely spoke of her, except to dismiss her as weak, reckless, and unfit to inherit. Most believed she had been exiled by choice. Few knew the truth. Evelyn's mother, Leonard's first wife, had left him after years of psychological abuse. Evelyn, just a teenager, endured her father's cutting remarks and impossible expectations. He wanted a son, an heir to mold into his image. Evelyn was never enough. When she rebelled, studying art instead of business, questioning his ethics, Leonard disowned her publicly. Their relationship collapsed in flames, and Isabella, the new wife, became a convenient target for Evelyn's resentment. Now, with Leonard dead, Evelyn's return shocked everyone. At a press conference, reporters shoved microphones in her face, asking if she was here to contest the will or fight Isabella for control. But Evelyn surprised them all. "I'm not here for money," she declared. "I'm here for truth. My father was a brilliant man, but he was also cruel. People need to know the man behind the empire." Her words landed like grenades. For the first time, someone from inside Leonard's bloodline admitted what outsiders had only speculated. And when she stood beside Isabella at the same podium, the image was almost unthinkable. The disowned daughter and the scorned widow, united against the ghost of Leonard Kane. Isabella herself felt a mixture of shock and caution. Evelyn had always despised her, throwing bitter accusations across family dinners, slamming doors in her face. But now Evelyn leaned close during a quiet moment and whispered, "He hurt you too, didn't he?" That single sentence shifted everything. In Evelyn's eyes, Isabella saw not just anger but recognition. They had both been victims of Leonard's shadow. But victims could become allies or rivals. Behind the scenes, Evelyn revealed pieces of her childhood. How Leonard forced her to spy on her mother, how he humiliated her at board meetings, how he once told her, "You'll never be a Kane. You're disposable." The pain in her voice carried a chilling authenticity. The alliance between Isabella and Evelyn shocked the board. Investors muttered about manipulation. The media painted it as a feminist rebellion. But one question hung in the air, sharper than all the others. Was Evelyn Kane truly standing beside Isabella out of solidarity, Or was she preparing to take everything for herself? Isabella Kane had been dismissed for years as nothing more than a billionaire's ornament, but with Leonard gone, she seized the reins of an empire the world assumed she could never control. The board expected hesitation, investors expected collapse, but what they witnessed instead was transformation. Why did she take such daring steps? How could she so quickly undo the foundations Leonard built? And what would it cost her to claim her own vision of power? The boardroom of Kane Industries had always been Leonard's kingdom: polished mahogany, walls lined with his portraits, a table where his voice thundered like law. Now, for the first time, Isabella sat at the head of that table. "Gentlemen," she began, her tone calm but commanding, "this company will no longer operate as a fortress of fear. We are rebuilding, not just profits but trust." The announcement was followed by a series of decisions that left executives stunned. Isabella ordered the reinstatement of worker pensions Leonard had stripped away. She demanded audits of offshore accounts long buried in secrecy. She initiated community programs in the very neighborhoods Leonard's ruthless acquisitions had destroyed. The media called it revolutionary. Workers called it justice. Investors called it madness. But Isabella didn't flinch. She walked through factory floors shaking hands with workers who had once only seen her in glossy magazines. She sat with union leaders Leonard had treated like enemies, listening to their grievances. Her approval ratings soared in the public eye, painting her as a reformer, the widow who turned tragedy into transformation. Behind closed doors, however, storms gathered. The board threatened lawsuits, claiming she was sabotaging profits. Politicians who had once depended on Leonard's bribes warned her that transparency would destroy relationships. And journalists began digging deeper, asking whether Isabella's sudden rise was fueled purely by conscience, or by ambition. Even Evelyn raised questions in private. "You're rewriting his empire," she said one night. "But are you doing it for justice, or for revenge?" Isabella looked out across the city skyline, her expression unreadable. "Does it matter?" she replied. The truth was more complicated. Isabella felt exhilaration in every bold decision. Each reform was not only a strike against Leonard's shadow but also proof to herself that she could lead. For years her voice had been silenced. Now the world was listening, and she was intoxicated by the power. But while the world debated her motives, another figure was watching from the shadows. Leonard, alive in Zurich, read the headlines and clenched his fists. To him, Isabella wasn't honoring or reforming, she was dismantling. And each piece she removed from his empire was another knife in his pride. "She thinks she's winning," he muttered into his glass of whiskey. "But she's only playing the game I started." Still, Isabella pressed forward, her every move shaking foundations. Yet even as applause grew louder, a chilling truth whispered beneath it all. Every empire transformed carries a price, and Isabella was about to discover hers. Isabella Kane believed she was finally in control of Leonard's empire, but a locked drawer in his private study reminded her that power always hides shadows. The widow thought she knew the man she had married, but what she found in those documents revealed a past darker and more twisted than she imagined. Why had Leonard hidden these secrets? How much danger did they place her in now? And what would she do with the knowledge that could either destroy him, or herself? The study had always been off-limits. Leonard guarded it like a dragon hoarding treasure, keeping even Isabella out with a sharp word or a cold stare. After his death, the room was sealed, but late one evening Isabella demanded it opened. The air inside smelled of leather, cigars, and something faintly metallic like blood trapped in wood. She searched the desk methodically. Contracts, financial records, personal notes, all meticulously ordered. But the bottom drawer was locked with a small rusted key she found taped beneath the desk. Inside, she discovered folders bound in red string. Each bore a name. Politicians, judges, journalists. Every file contained evidence of corruption, bribes, blackmail, secret recordings. Leonard hadn't just bought influence, he had built an arsenal of leverage. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the papers. There were photos of judges in compromising positions, transcripts of private conversations between senators, receipts for payments hidden in shell companies. Each file was a weapon, enough to topple reputations and governments. And then she found something far more personal. A file marked Evelyn. Inside were surveillance reports of Leonard's own daughter. Letters intercepted, phone calls recorded, even a psychiatric evaluation he had secretly ordered after she turned 18. Her breath caught. Leonard hadn't just disowned Evelyn. He had stalked her, documented her every move as if preparing to destroy her if she ever dared challenge him. Worse still, at the back of the drawer lay a file labeled Isabella. Inside were photos of her as a young law student, letters she had written to professors, even transcripts of private calls with her late father. Leonard had been watching her long before they married. The realization sank into her chest like ice. She hadn't been chosen for love or even companionship. She had been studied, groomed, and selected as part of a strategy. But the deepest cut was a handwritten note in Leonard's precise scrawl. Isabella is intelligent, useful. But never forget, she is also dangerous. Prepare contingencies. For a long moment, Isabella sat in silence, the papers spread before her like a battlefield. She wasn't his partner. She was his project. His possession. His threat. Tears pricked her eyes, but rage quickly burned them away. She stacked the files neatly, her mind racing. Leonard had used these secrets to control others, but now they were in her hands. Was this her greatest weapon or her greatest curse? As she closed the drawer, she caught her reflection in the glass of Leonard's portrait above the desk. For the first time she wondered, was she truly free of him, or had she just stepped into the role he had designed all along? Leonard Kane was a man the world believed buried, but his reappearance turned grief into outrage and admiration into suspicion. The empire mourned him as a fallen titan, but when he walked into the spotlight alive, he was no longer just a billionaire, he was a storm. Why had he faked his death? How much had he seen while hiding? And what would his return mean for Isabella, Evelyn, and Daniel, who had already begun rewriting his legacy? It began with a leak. A grainy video circulated online showing Leonard stepping out of a private jet in Zurich. At first, people dismissed it as a lookalike or a cruel hoax. But within hours, confirmation came: Leonard Kane was alive. The media erupted. Headlines screamed betrayal. Commentators demanded answers. Some called it the greatest con in corporate history, others labeled it treason against shareholders and the public. But one question rose louder than all the rest. Why? Leonard didn't wait long to answer. 3 days later, he strode into a press conference in New York, flanked by lawyers and bodyguards. Cameras flashed like lightning as he raised a hand for silence. My death was necessary, he declared, his voice thunderous. Necessary to reveal who could be trusted, who would betray me, and who would rise against me. Now the truth is clear. Gasps rippled through the crowd. His words cut like a blade, aimed not at strangers but at those closest to him. Isabella, watching from the manor, felt her chest tighten. Her reforms, her alliances, her fragile claim to power, everything she had built was now under siege. Evelyn sat beside her, pale but defiant, muttering, "The ghost returns." Daniel Reed's reaction was more visceral. He smashed a glass against a wall in his apartment. "He's back from the grave to finish me," he spat. Anne Charlotte Gray, the mistress-turned-author, simply smirked from her newsroom desk. "Told you so," she whispered to no one. The fallout was immediate. The board froze Isabella's authority, insisting Leonard would reclaim his role. Markets plunged, investors panicked, and Isabella's public image wavered between sympathy and suspicion. Some accused her of conspiring with Leonard to manipulate markets. Others believed she had genuinely been betrayed. Then came the cruelest twist of all. In the same press conference, Leonard turned his gaze coldly toward the cameras. "My so-called widow," he said, "has overstepped. She has dismantled what I built. She has aligned herself with traitors. And she will answer for it." It was not just a claim of survival, it was a declaration of war. For the first time since his supposed death, Isabella felt fear. Not of losing power but of losing herself. Leonard was alive, yes, but he was also more dangerous than ever, armed with the knowledge of who had dared to challenge him. As the press conference ended, the world held its breath. Leonard Kane had returned, but the man who walked back into the light wasn't the same one who had left it. He wasn't just reclaiming his empire, he was hunting. Leonard Kane had returned to reclaim everything, but his enemies were no longer scattered and afraid. He thought his empire would fold back into his grasp, but instead he faced a coalition of voices armed with secrets, scars, and vengeance. Why had fate turned his own blood, his brother, his mistress, and his widow into a united front? How far would each of them go to bring him down? And what truths would finally be unleashed in a war where every word was a weapon? The battle began in whispers, then roared in headlines. Charlotte Gray, the journalist scorned as a mistress, published follow-up chapters to her memoir, feeding the flames of Leonard's hypocrisy. Evelyn Kane, once the disowned daughter, gave televised interviews recounting his cruelty, her voice trembling but unyielding. Daniel Reed, the brother branded a thief, released financial records proving Leonard had framed him decades ago. And Isabella Kane, Leonard's widow, stood at the center, no longer silent. She spoke not as a victim but as a leader, calling Leonard's return a manipulation of grief and a desecration of truth. The public divided sharply. Some still idolized Leonard as a genius who had outsmarted the world, arguing that deception proved his brilliance. Others rallied behind Isabella and her allies, framing them as survivors of a tyrant's reign. The war wasn't just over money or power, it was over memory itself, over who Leonard Kane truly was. Behind closed doors, alliances were uneasy. Evelyn still distrusted Isabella, occasionally snapping, "You wore his ring while he destroyed me." Daniel bristled at working with Charlotte, muttering that she was just another of Leonard's pawns. Even Isabella herself questioned whether Charlotte sought justice, or just another bestseller. But they shared one goal: Leonard must fall. In response, Leonard unleashed his arsenal. Those secret files Isabella had found in his study? Leonard had duplicates. Judges, politicians, and CEOs suddenly stepped forward to defend him, their loyalties bought and blackmailed. Investigations against him mysteriously vanished. News outlets were pressured to silence dissent. Still, Isabella struck back. Leaking parts of Leonard's hidden documents to the press, she exposed corruption at the highest levels. Each revelation weakened his shield, forcing him to fight not just his enemies but the crumbling pillars of his empire. The war escalated onto television screens, courtroom steps, and trading floors. Markets seesawed wildly. Talk shows debated whether Leonard was a visionary or a villain. Social media became a battlefield of hashtags. Hashtag Team Isabella and hashtag Kane Lives. But the most brutal blow came not from Isabella, but from Evelyn. In a primetime interview, she revealed a secret so personal it silenced even Leonard's staunchest defenders. "My father staged his death not to protect us, but to test us. He wanted to see who would be loyal. He wanted to break us from beyond the grave. And I will not let him succeed." The confession cut through the noise. It reframed Leonard's return not as triumph, but as obsession. His empire was no longer a monument to brilliance, it was the playground of a man consumed by control. Leonard, watching the interview from his penthouse, clenched his jaw. His enemies weren't merely resisting him anymore, they were dismantling his myth. And for the first time he realized the war might not end with his victory, but with a truth too powerful for even him to bury. Leonard Kane believed he could outwit death itself, but his final move was the one no one saw coming. He thought he was the puppeteer pulling every string, but the truth revealed he had been a pawn in a much larger game. Why had he miscalculated so badly? How could his empire slip through his fingers even in life and death? And what would the ultimate revelation mean for Isabella, Evelyn, Daniel, and Charlotte, who thought they had finally defeated him? The world braced itself for the courtroom showdown. Leonard was set to testify, Isabella prepared her evidence, Evelyn steeled herself to face her father, Daniel gathered documents proving decades of fraud, and Charlotte sharpened her pen for the story of a lifetime. It felt like the climax of a war where justice would finally decide the victor. But then the twist came. On the eve of the trial, Isabella received a package delivered to her door. No sender. No return address. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note in Leonard's unmistakable script. "The truth is never what it seems." The drive contained hours of video diaries, confessions, plans, rants Leonard had recorded over the years. But the most shocking part wasn't Leonard's voice. It was the presence of another figure in the background of those videos. Isabella. Not the Isabella of now, the reformer, the widow, the fighter, but a younger Isabella sitting silently in shadow. In some recordings, Leonard discussed his schemes while glancing at her as if she already knew. In others, he handed her documents to review, papers she signed without hesitation. The implication was staggering. Had Isabella been complicit all along? Had she helped build the very empire she now claimed to dismantle? When the videos leaked, whether by Leonard's hand or another's, the world gasped. The widow who had become a symbol of defiance was suddenly painted as an accomplice. Commentators scrambled. Was she a victim who had been manipulated into silence, or a strategist who had played both sides from the beginning? Evelyn, heartbroken, confronted her stepmother. "Tell me it's not true. Tell me you weren't part of this." Isabella's only reply was silence. Daniel, furious, accused her of orchestrating the entire saga. "Maybe Leonard was never the mastermind, maybe you were." Charlotte, ever the observer, simply whispered to herself, "The story just wrote its own ending." But the final, cruelest twist was this. In the last video, Leonard smiled into the camera, his voice chillingly calm. "Legacy isn't about truth. It's about who controls the story. And whether I win or lose, the world will never know who was truly in control. Me or Isabella? That is the game. That is the victory. In that moment, everything fractured. Was Leonard confessing? Or was he framing Isabella in his final act of domination? The evidence could be read both ways, leaving the world in permanent uncertainty. The trial never settled the question. Leonard's empire crumbled, Isabella disappeared from public view, Evelyn sought healing abroad, Daniel vanished again, and Charlotte closed her memoir with one haunting line. Perhaps Leonard Kane never truly returned from the dead, because he never left us at all. And so the legacy of Leonard Kane lived on, not in wealth or power, but in a mystery that made the world wonder. Who was the real mastermind?